What's happening?
Where?
What's going down, bro?
Going down. Oh, yeah, just blowing the froth off a couple.
In 2001, the third Crocodile Dundee film was released, entitled Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles. It was a critical and financial failure when compared to the first two films in the franchise, with many critics calling it unnecessary and that it lacked any charm of the original. Some people that I know were not even aware that this film even existed. It was nominated at the time for a Razzie Award for Worst Remake or Sequel, crushing any chances of there ever being a fourth film in the series. I'm a huge fan of the Crocodile Dundee films, so purely for entertainment purposes today, let's discuss the possibility of a part 4 and should it happen. In 1986, the world was first introduced to Crocodile Dundee, the story of Michael J. Crocodile Dundee and his journey in meeting a beautiful news reporter who is intrigued by his story of how he lost half a leg to a crocodile, then he crawled hundreds of miles to safety. The two meet in his township called Walkabout Creek in the Northern Territories. She learns that the croc only gave him what he calls a love bite, and she begins to write her new story about him. She then decides to bring Mick back to New York City as a wrap to her story. It's the classic fish out of water story, and it's a brilliant, charming romantic comedy. It was a smash hit when released, critically and financially, earning $328 million on an $8.8 million budget. 2 years later, Crocodile Dundee II was released to again being a massive financial success, although much less critically successful than the first film. It would then be another 13 years before Paul Hogan decided to revisit Mick Dundee in what would become known as Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles. I think back in 2001, Croc 3 was maybe a little bit ahead of its time. By that I mean we hadn't really seen a character that was away for so long then making a comeback in the 2000s. We will see this later on, of course, with many other 80s stars in films like Rocky Balboa in 2006, Die Hard 4 in 2007, Indiana Jones 4 in 2008, Rambo 4 also in 2008, and then Top Gun Maverick in 2022, and finally Beverly Hills Cop in 2024. In 2001, was there really a need or a desire by fans to have a third Crocodile Dundee film? I believe that this is why it did so poorly, just purely poor timing. I believe that the filmmakers tried to make it so that fans of the original would now take their children and they would all go and enjoy it. However, in 2001, children wouldn't have been that desperate for a new Crocodile Dundee film. As I understand, the writers thought the best approach would be like a family comedy film, which is totally fine, but there was just so much competition that year with films like Monsters, Inc., Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Shrek, and then Jurassic Park 3. In a 2020 interview, Paul Hogan said this about the possibility of Crocodile Dundee 4.
Will there be another Crocodile Dundee film?
Oh, I don't reckon, no. Someone would have to come up with a brilliant script with a really worthwhile idea for dragging him out of retirement, but no, it's highly unlikely.
So he doesn't think it'll happen, and realistically, it probably won't. The man is 85 years old now, and quite frankly, he deserves a quiet family life with his grandchildren. However, let's just say for fun that the perfect Crocodile Dundee 4 script did exist. What could potentially happen to the beloved Croc Dundee in a part 4 in the series? Here are just some of my ideas. Firstly, I think that technology must be the focus of the jokes and the gags, obviously in a exaggerated way. By this I mean maybe he's been living in Walkabout Creek in the Northern Territory all these years since the third film. The world has changed around him, but he has not. He has been stuck in his old ways. if Linda Kozłowski wanted to be part of the film, then they could make it work, but I doubt she would want to be involved after being married to Paul Hogan and then eventually divorcing him in 2014. So let's leave her character out of this for the sake of these story ideas. At first, I had the idea of like keep it in Australia, and maybe his grandson had got a position of like a zoo manager at the Australian Zoo, and he wants his grandfather Mick Dundee there as kind of like the front man or like some sort of an advisor to animal welfare. Maybe Mick is retired, living alone. I don't think Sue would have ever divorced Mick, so let's just say for this story that she has passed away, maybe a few years after the third film. He's possibly bored and thinking that of his adventures that are behind him. When his grandson contacts him about a position at the Australian Zoo, Mick is delighted and takes the job. His grandson then shows Mick around the big cities, and it's a totally bizarre experience to Mick. Maybe there are things like taxis driving themselves, like with no drivers, people flying drones in the parks, and he thinks they're like birds of prey hovering over babies' prams, so he like takes down the drones. He's not used to modern technology at the zoo, so maybe some mishaps occur, animals escape, and they must restore order. Or maybe they get caught up in some sort of conspiracy going on behind the scenes in the zoo. So that was one idea that I had, but then I thought it might be too out there and didn't sound all that exciting to bring an audience back for a fourth film after all these years. So then I came up with the idea of doing something kind of like a requel. So familiar but fresh, I think would be the best approach. So again, maybe Sue passed away a few years after Croc 3. And again, staying with the idea that the world has changed, but Mick hasn't moved on with the times. This time, maybe his granddaughter is a journalist and gets a job at the same paper that her grandmother used to work at in New York. And she wants as her sort of first big story at the newspaper to do a follow-up to The Crocodile Man, the same story that her grandmother wrote like almost 40 years ago. So she contacts her grandfather Mick and invites him to New York. Again, maybe Mick is bored and he thinks his adventures are behind him. So he's delighted at the idea of a follow-up story and more than happy to go to New York again because it'll be just as he remembers it. As he arrives in New York, it's radically different to how he remembers. Maybe again, there's driverless taxis from the airport. Everything in his hotel suite is like voice controlled, so he struggles to get things to work. Again, maybe there's a scene in Central Park where people are flying drones and he believes them to be some sort of birds of prey that he's never seen before and he takes them out. And then meanwhile, while all this is going on, maybe Rico's grandson, so Rico is the villain from the second film. Maybe he's taken over his grandfather's drug circle, something like that, and he's learned of Dundee's return to New York, so maybe he kidnaps Mick's granddaughter for revenge for his family, and Mick has to save her. Again, you could play this out with tributes to the first and second films throughout the film, end on something like really triumphant, end on really a high note that signifies like the true end for the franchise. That was like the best idea that, in my mind, that would be a pretty cool idea for Croc Dundee IV. So keep things familiar to the first two films, but also a fresh, modern twist. I think that would be the best approach, in my opinion. Now, should Crocodile Dundee IV actually happen? You know what? I'm going to say, yeah, why the heck not? I'm all for a fourth film and possibly the final entry in the series. All the Crocodile Dundee films are such fun to watch, and I've always had a great time when watching them. Should it have a theatrical release? Probably not. Maybe straight to a streaming service like Beverly Hills Cop 4 did. I think Paul Hogan really deserves one last crack at a character that he absolutely loves, a character that made him famous around the world. And yeah, I'm totally up for Crocodile Dundee 4. So if it happens one day, great, I'll be there to see it. And if not, it'll just be something that we have always dreamed about, but never came to fruition.
Come on. Flat out like a lizard drinking.
Say what?
What?